Welcome, friend. Tonight, I invite you on a journey through time, one that may shake the way you imagine the Middle Ages. When we think of medieval Europe, the images that often spring to mind are knights in shining armor, noble ladies in castles, and bustling marketplaces filled with the aromas of roasted meats and sweet wines. But what if I told you that beneath this romantic veneer lies a reality far grimmer, far stranger, and far more shocking than any fairy tale could suggest? Before we begin, take a deep breath and get comfortable. If this story captures your imagination, a like and subscription would mean so much. It helps me bring more stories like this to you. I'd love to know where you're joining and what time it is for you. It's always a little wonder to see how far our cozy community stretches. And while you lie back, letting sleep creep gently over you, your imagination will awaken and walk through the muddy streets, the candlelit halls, and the shadowed corners of a medieval world that was anything but simple. Take a slow breath in and let it out. Feel the modern world soften around you. The hum of your room fades. The glow of your screen becomes a distant flicker. Soon, you'll find yourself transported to a time when survival was fragile, when belief and superstition ruled, and when life was often lived at the edge of hunger, disease, and despair. This is not the Middle Ages of storybooks. This is the shocking truth about medieval times. As you close your eyes, we will peel back the layers of myth and reveal the raw, unvarnished truth about life in the Middle Ages. Picture yourself stepping barefoot onto uneven cobblestones. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of smoke and waste. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, marking another hour, though clocks are rare and most cannot tell the time with precision. You pull your cloak tighter, and the chill seeps through. Around you, life bustles, but not as you might expect. Children scurry barefoot through the mud, their laughter interrupted by coughs. Women haggle for vegetables that are already beginning to rot. A man with missing teeth takes a swig of ale, for water itself is unsafe. And above all this hum of existence, you notice something else, the stench. It clings to your nose, overwhelming and unavoidable. Human waste, animal droppings, smoke, sweat, and damp straw are the perfumes of the medieval city. Take another breath. Let the image form fully. You are no longer a modern traveler. You are a medieval soul, awakening into a world you must endure. Congratulations. You've made it to the Middle Ages, but survival is not guaranteed. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas in your bed, the rats in your cellar, and the illnesses lurking in every crowded street. The truth is that the medieval world was not built for comfort. It was a place of extremes, deep faith and terrible superstition, noble ideals of chivalry alongside brutal realities of war, breathtaking cathedrals rising above towns that reeked of rot. People lived closer to death than we can easily imagine today. Tonight, we'll prepare you for the journey. We'll uncover why so many of our assumptions about medieval life are shaped by myth. We'll explore how people lived, what they feared, how they coped with hunger, dirt, violence, and disease. And most importantly, we'll see that beneath the shock and strangeness, there was still humanity, laughter, love, and resilience. So, let's begin. Let's step deeper into the medieval night. Most of what we think we know about the Middle Ages comes from a mixture of legend, literature, and Hollywood invention. Castles appear clean and gleaming, knights uphold noble codes, peasants cheerfully sing as they till the fields. It's an image designed to charm, to entertain, and sometimes to inspire nostalgia for a simpler past. But the truth is, life was rarely simple, and it was never clean. For peasants, survival was a daily challenge. For nobles, the trappings of luxury often hide filth and disease. Even the great castles, those mighty symbols of wealth and power, were filled with smoke, lice, and draughts so bitter that tapestries could only do so much to ward off the cold. When we replace myth with reality, we find a world shockingly different from the storybook. A world where bread could kill you, where medical treatments were more dangerous than the illness itself, where childbirth carried terrifying risks, and where justice was as brutal as it was public. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, we'll let go of Hollywood's illusions. We'll allow ourselves to see, smell, and feel the Middle Ages as they truly were. And in that honesty, we'll find not just horror, but fascination, the resilience of humanity enduring in a world that was often stacked against it. To ground ourselves, let's imagine a typical morning for someone living in medieval Europe. You awaken not in a soft bed but on a straw mattress, crawling with lice and fleas. If you're lucky, the straw was replaced recently. If not, it is damp, foul-smelling, and alive with movement. Your blanket may be a rough woolen cloth, itchy against your skin. Your room is dim. The only light comes from a small window or a crack in the shutters. The first sound you hear is not the chirping of birds but the clatter of wooden pails, the coughing of neighbors, or the distant cry of animals. The air inside is thick with smoke from last night's fire, mixed with the sour scent of unwashed bodies. Personal hygiene is minimal, not from laziness, but from necessity. Soap is rare and expensive. Water, often drawn from wells or streams contaminated with waste, is risky to use. You stumble to the chamber pot in the corner, or, if you're in a poorer household, perhaps you relieve yourself in a bucket to be emptied later into the street. In towns and cities, human waste was often tossed right out the window, sometimes with the courtesy warning shout of "Guard Lou." Beware the water, though the contents were far from clean. If you live in the countryside, your morning is simpler but still harsh. You step outside onto packed earth, perhaps shared with animals. A cow lows, a chicken scurries across your path. The cold air bites, and you hurry to strike the fire, if you have wood left to burn. For many, fuel is scarce, and gathering it risks finds from the local lord's forests. Breakfast is meager. The staple is bread, dense, coarse, often made from rye or barley. In years of famine, desperate bakers may stretch the flour with ground beans, acorns, or even chalk. Sometimes, ergot fungus infects the rye, leading to SD. Anthony's fire, a terrifying illness that causes burning sensations, convulsions, and even gangrene. And yet, you eat, because hunger waits for no one. To wash it down, you drink ale, weak, but safer than water. Children drink it too. Milk is less common. Much of it is used to make butter or cheese. For peasants, meat is rare. For nobles, it is abundant, though heavily salted or spiced to mask the taste of age. And so your day begins, not with comfort, but with the business of survival. When we picture a medieval castle or village, we often imagine sweeping stone courtyards, shimmering armor, and elegant banquets. But the truth? Hygiene was nearly non-existent by our standards. Bathing was rare, not because people hated water, but because clean water was hard to come by and bathing was often linked with sin. In fact, some religious leaders argued that washing the body too often was a form of vanity, an indulgence that distracted from cleansing the soul. And so, people wore their dirt like a second skin. Clothes were not washed frequently, either. Woolen garments were brushed and beaten rather than scrubbed, and linen underclothes, if you were fortunate enough to own them, might boil occasionally. But the idea of a laundry routine, of fresh outfits every few days, was a luxury far beyond the imagination of ordinary medieval folk. Even nobles, who had access to private baths and perfumed oils, still lived surrounded by lice and fleas. Queen Elizabeth I, centuries later in the 16th century, famously claimed she bathed once a month whether she needed it or not, and she was considered modern by comparison. The average peasant? Bathing might be a once-a-year occurrence, tied to religious festivals or the warming days of midsummer. Until then, dirt accumulated, layered with sweat, smoke, and the natural oils of the body. And to mask it, people turned to perfumes, herbs, and scented pouches, dangling them from belts or tucking them into sleeves. The rich wore gloves perfumed with lavender. The poor relied on smoke from a hearth to chase away the worst of the smell. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace. The mingling odors are overwhelming. Butchered meat beginning to sour, fish caught days ago lying in the sun, piles of human and animal waste rotting in the gutters. Horses clatter past, leaving steaming piles behind. And above it all, the people themselves, unwashed and unshaven, their clothes stiff with sweat and grime. It was not the fragrant, picturesque setting of a fairy tale, but a choking, overwhelming reality. Perhaps the most shocking truth about medieval life is that water, the very thing we consider essential for health, was often more dangerous than helpful. Wells, streams, and rivers were routinely contaminated with waste. Towns dumped sewage directly into waterways, and the same rivers where laundry was scrubbed also served as places for butchery and tanning hides, releasing foul chemicals and blood. Drinking water, therefore, could be lethal. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses swept through communities with devastating effects. Instead, ale and weak beer became the common drink. Even children consumed it daily. Wine, when available, was consumed more for preservation than taste, sour, vinegary, and often mixed with spices to mask the bite. For nobles, imported wines from France, Spain, or the Mediterranean were a sign of wealth, but even these could sour quickly in transport. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were treasured not only for flavor but for their ability to disguise spoilage. Thus, water, the simplest and purest symbol of life, became instead a source of fear, a paradox that shaped medieval diets, culture, and survival. If there is one detail that can immediately shatter the romantic image of medieval life, it is this: vermin were everywhere. Rats thrived in towns and castles alike, feasting on grain stores, gnawing on furniture, and spreading fleas that carried the most devastating disease in European history, the Black Death. But even in the absence of plague, rats and mice were constant companions. They shared the home, the food, and sometimes the bed. Cats helped to control them, but superstition often led to cats being distrusted or killed, especially black cats, linked to witchcraft. This only made rodent infestations worse. Fleas and lice were so common that medieval people developed combs, ointments, and rituals specifically to cope with them. It was not unusual to sit by the fire, methodically picking lice from hair or seams of clothing. Bedbugs infested straw mattresses, and without regular replacement, the straw itself became a writhing nest. Parasites were not confined to the outside of the body. Worms, tapeworms, and other intestinal invaders were widespread due to contaminated food and poor sanitation. Medical texts describe remedies ranging from herbal concoctions to bizarre charms, but relief was limited. Most people simply learned to live with discomfort. If you were to sit down at a medieval table, you might be surprised, not by abundance, but by the strangeness of what was served. For peasants, the staple was pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables could be gathered. Meat was rare, often reserved for feast days. Fish was more common, especially for those living near rivers or coasts, but it too could spoil quickly without proper preservation. Bread was life, but it was not the soft, fluffy loaf we know today. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes filled with additives to stretch the flour. Rye bread, in particular, carried the risk of ergot contamination, which could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Nobles dined more extravagantly, with roasted game, swan, or even peacock. Yet even their tables were not free from danger. Preservation methods, salting, smoking, or spicing, could not fully prevent spoilage. Food poisoning was common, though its causes were poorly understood. Spices became a mark of wealth and power. To serve a dish flavored with cinnamon or saffron was to proclaim one's status. But underneath the gilded feasts, the same realities remained: hunger, scarcity, and the constant risk that what you ate might harm you as much as it nourished. Beyond physical struggles, medieval people lived in a world shaped by belief, both comforting and terrifying. The church was the central authority, dictating not only religious practice but also daily life. From birth to death, every stage of existence was marked by ritual: baptism, confession, marriage, and burial. To defy the church was to risk both social ruin and eternal damnation. But where knowledge was limited, superstition flourished. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or the work of evil spirits. A child's fever might be blamed on the evil eye. A poor harvest could be attributed to witchcraft. Celestial events, eclipses, comets, strange weather, were viewed as omens, signs of God's wrath or warnings of disaster. Amulets, charms, and relics were carried for protection. Holy water was sprinkled in doorways. People turned to saints for intercession, lighting candles and praying for miracles. At the same time, they feared curses, spells, and demons lurking in the night. This combination of faith and fear shaped every decision, every action. It gave me hope, but also deepened anxiety. Imagine living in a world where every shadow might hide a spirit, where every sickness could mean divine judgment, and where the wrong word or action might bring ruin upon your family. Perhaps the most shocking truth of all, medieval life was short. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, though this is skewed by the high rate of infant mortality. Many children never reached their first birthday. Women risked death with every childbirth. Men faced danger in the fields, on the roads, and in wars that seemed endless. Even those who survived into adulthood lived under the constant shadow of disease. Plagues, famines, and accidents claimed lives swiftly. A simple wound could fester into a fatal infection. A winter without enough firewood could mean death by cold. And yet, life went on. People married young, raised families, worked on the land, and gathered in markets. They laughed, sang, told stories, and prayed. Death was never far away, but neither was life, in all its small joys and stubborn endurance. This is only the beginning. Already, the veil of myth has lifted, and we see the Middle Ages in a truer, harsher light. But there is more to uncover. Let's explore the shocking truths in greater depth. How justice was delivered with brutal creativity, how medicine often causes more harm than healing, how the Black Death reshaped Europe in ways still felt today, how daily survival required resilience, cunning, and sometimes cruelty. For now, let this truth settle into your mind. The medieval world was not golden or romantic. It was muddy, dangerous, smelly, and short. And yet, it was also a time of incredible human endurance, where people made meaning in the face of hardship and created beauty amid the filth. Take another slow breath. Picture the medieval street once more, the mud, the noise, the stench, and know you are only at the beginning of this journey. Now, let's dive into the myth of medieval medicine. When we think of medicine today, we imagine sterile hospitals, trained doctors, and advanced tools. But in the Middle Ages, medicine was a blend of trial, error, superstition, and limited knowledge. Doctors existed, but their training was rooted in the works of ancient scholars like Galen and Hippocrates, texts copied and recopied for centuries. Their theories centered on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to come from an imbalance in these fluids, and treatment aimed to restore harmony. What did this mean in practice? Bloodletting, leeches, purging, and strange diets. A fever might be treated by draining blood from the veins. Stomach troubles might be blamed on excess black bile, requiring laxatives or vomiting. Herbs did play an important role. Garlic was used to fight infections. Willow bark, rich in natural salicylic acid, was chewed for pain relief, a forerunner to aspirin. But without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, even the best remedies had limits. Surgery existed, but without anesthesia or antiseptics. Imagine a broken bone being reset by force, or an abscess lanced with a heated knife. The pain was unimaginable, the risk of infection overwhelming. Barbers, yes, barbers, often doubled as surgeons, performing bloodletting and minor operations alongside cutting hair. The familiar red and white barber pole may even symbolize this bloody history. And then there were the quacks, the charlatans selling miracle potions and charms. Some promised cures through astrology, others through strange concoctions of crushed gems, powdered bones, or animal organs. Desperate patients, with little alternative, paid what they could in hope rather than expectation. The shocking truth is this: medicine in the Middle Ages often harmed as much as it helped. And yet, people clung to it, because the alternative, doing nothing, felt even worse. For medieval women, childbirth was perhaps the greatest danger of all. Without modern medicine, every pregnancy carries risk. Complications such as breaches, births, hemorrhage, or infection were often fatal. Midwives assisted, using experience passed down through generations, but their tools were limited. Herbs like pennyroyal or sage might be used to ease pain or stimulate contractions, but there was no guarantee. Infant mortality was staggering. Many children did not survive their first year. Diseases we now consider minor, like measles or whooping cough, could be deadly. For a mother, losing multiple children was not unusual. It was expected. Even noble women, surrounded by wealth, could not escape this reality. Queens and princesses died in childbirth with alarming frequency. The pressure to produce heirs only increased the risk, as women endured repeated pregnancies year after year. To prepare for labor, women turned to faith and ritual. Charms were tied to their clothing, prayers whispered to saints. In some cases, relics of holy figures were placed in the birthing chamber, believed to provide divine protection. Yet despite the danger, life continued. Families were large, not because children always survived, but because so many did not. In this endless cycle of birth and loss, the medieval household was shaped by both love and grief. Forget the image of idle peasants lounging in fields or noble knights always in armor. The reality of medieval work was relentless. Peasants rose with the sun and labored until dusk. Their tasks shifted with the seasons: plowing, planting, harvesting, threshing, gathering firewood, and tending livestock. Every day was a fight against time and nature. A poor harvest could mean hunger or starvation, not just for one family but for an entire village. For women, work was doubled. They labored in the fields alongside men, then returned home to tend to cooking, spinning, weaving, and child-rearing. A woman might bake bread at dawn, carry water from the well, gather herbs for meals, and still be expected to patch clothing by candlelight. Children worked too, from the moment they were old enough to carry a bucket or scare birds from crops. Education, outside the church or wealthy households, was rare. Most learned only the skills needed for survival. And for nobles, life was not as leisurely as it might seem. Yes, they were free from manual labor, but their duties carried weight. Managing estates, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and maintaining defenses were constant responsibilities. Knights trained endlessly, not just for war but for the display of status in tournaments. Failure could mean dishonor or ruin. The shocking truth is that medieval society allowed no idleness. Every class bore its burdens, and survival depended on relentless effort. When modern people think of medieval justice, they often imagine dungeons, chains, and torture devices. And while some of this is true, the reality was both simpler and more brutal. Justice was swift and public. Theft might be punished by whipping, mutilation, or hanging. A person accused of witchcraft could face burning. Adultery, depending on one's status, might result in shame, exile, or worse. Trials were not based on evidence as we know it today. Instead, ordeals were common: carrying a red-hot iron, plunging a hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a river. If the wound healed cleanly, you were considered innocent, a test of divine judgment. For nobles, justice looked different. A knight accused of wrongdoing might demand trial by combat, believing that God would grant victory to the righteous. Punishments were not only about crime, they were about spectacle. Executions drew crowds, serving as both warning and entertainment. Gallows stood at the crossroads, bodies left to rot as grim reminders. This was justice in the medieval world: harsh, uneven, and often deadly. No discussion of medieval life is complete without the plague, the Black Death of the 14th century. Arriving in Europe around 1347, it spread with terrifying speed. Carried by fleas on rats, it ravaged towns and villages, killing up to half the population in some regions. Whole families perished in days. Streets filled with corpses. Fear gripped every corner of life. People searched for explanations. Some blamed the stars, others accused minorities such as Jews, leading to horrific persecutions. Many turned to flagellation, whipping themselves in penance, believing the plague was God's punishment. Medical knowledge was powerless. Doctors wore long, beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing they filtered out poisoned air. But nothing stopped the spread. The aftermath reshaped Europe. Labor shortages gave peasants new bargaining power. Whole villages disappeared. The church's authority was questioned, as prayers failed to stop the dying. And a deep scar was left on the collective memory of Europe, a reminder of life's fragility. The shocking truth? The plague was not an isolated event. Disease, in many forms, stalked medieval life constantly. Smallpox, leprosy, and countless fevers claimed lives without warning. The Black Death was only the most devastating chapter in a long, unending battle against invisible enemies. You might imagine knights on horseback riding from castle to castle, or merchants carrying goods across land. But medieval travel was no easy adventure. Roads were dangerous, often little more than muddy tracks. Bandits lurked in forests, preying on travelers. Bridges were rare, forcing people to wade through rivers or rely on ferrymen. Journeys that take hours require weeks. A trip from London to Rome could mean months on the road, with constant risk of illness, robbery, or exhaustion. There were few inns, often dirty and crowded. Many travelers relied on monasteries for shelter. Yet despite these hardships, trade thrived. Merchants carried spices, silks, and metals across continents. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to reach holy sites. And armies marched for weeks on campaigns that often ended in hunger and disease as much as in battle. Travel was possible, but it was never safe, never easy. Perhaps the greatest shock of all is how far from reality was from the romance we imagine. Knights were not always chivalrous heroes. Many were brutal enforcers. Castles were not pristine palaces but cold, smoky fortresses. Feasts were not endless abundance but rare breaks from scarcity. The shining image of the Middle Ages, shaped by centuries of art, poetry, and modern storytelling, hides the mud, the blood, and the suffering. Yet it also hides the resilience, the creativity, and the humanity of those who lived through it. You've now walked through medicine, childbirth, justice, plague, and travel, the raw truths that define the medieval world. But our journey isn't finished. We'll explore how belief, superstition, and culture colored every aspect of life, why people feared witches and demons, how entertainment blended with violence, how faith held people together in times of despair, and how, against all odds, beauty and art flourished amid hardship. Take another deep breath. The medieval world is opening before you, raw, harsh, and strangely familiar. And in the last stage of this introduction, we'll draw even closer to the heart of its shocking truths. If there is one element of medieval life that most shocks us today, it is the fragility of childhood. Modern parents, with vaccinations, balanced diets, and relatively safe living conditions, expect their children to survive into adulthood. But in the Middle Ages, survival was never guaranteed. Up to half of all children died before the age of 5. The causes were numerous: infectious disease, malnutrition, contaminated food and water, accidents, and the sheer lack of medical knowledge. A small scratch could fester into a deadly infection. A cough might become pneumonia. A contaminated meal might bring dysentery. But while this reality sounds unbearably tragic to us, medieval parents adapted. They loved their children, but they also knew that grief was almost inevitable. Many scholars suggest that parents formed a kind of emotional shield, never allowing themselves to fully relax into joy, because death so often came knocking. Baptisms were conducted quickly after birth, not only as a spiritual safeguard for the infant soul, but also because no one knew how many days or weeks the child might survive. Children who did live past their early years often went straight into labor. By 7 or 8, they were expected to contribute, tending animals, gathering firewood, working in the fields, or serving in another household. Childhood, as we imagine it, with toys, games, and schooling, was a luxury for very few. And yet, children still find ways to laugh. Simple games with sticks or carved dolls, chasing chickens through the yard, or splashing in muddy puddles. Joy was present, though fleeting. But the shadow of mortality never lifted entirely. Another shocking truth lies in how justice was carried out. Today, we debate human rights, fair trials, and proportional punishments. In the medieval world, justice was both theatrical and brutal. Crimes such as theft, heresy, or treason could be punished with whipping, mutilation, or death. Public executions were not only common but deliberately staged as spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch hangings, beheadings, or burnings at the stake. These events were meant to terrify the populace into obedience, to display the power of the rulers, and to satisfy a community's hunger for vengeance. Even smaller offenses carried shocking penalties. A thief might lose a hand. A liar or blasphemer might have their tongue pierced with a hot iron. Stocks and pillories humiliated offenders in the town square, leaving them open to scorn and sometimes physical abuse by their neighbors. And trials themselves were often less about evidence and more about divine will. Trial by ordeal, plunging a hand into boiling water, carrying a hot iron, or being thrown into water to see if one sank or floated, was believed to reveal Goddess judgment. If the accused survived or healed quickly, they were considered innocent. If not, they were guilty. Justice, in other words, was as much ritual and performance as it was fairness. And for the accused, it was terrifyingly arbitrary. It is impossible to understand medieval life without appreciating the overwhelming power of religion. The church was not simply a spiritual institution, it was the backbone of society, education, law, and morality. From birth to death, life was structured by religious rites. Church bells marked the hours. Saints' feast days shaped the calendar. Pilgrimages drew the faithful across countries, walking for weeks to reach a holy shrine. And for many, heaven and hell were not abstract concepts but tangible realities, influencing every decision. But with this deep devotion also came fear. Hell was depicted in vivid sermons and artwork, filled with fire, demons, and eternal torment. Sin was believed to invite plagues, famine, or divine wrath. Superstition intertwined with faith. Charms, relics, and blessings were sought for protection. At the same time, corruption within the church shocked many contemporaries. Indulgences, payments for forgiveness, became a widespread scandal. Wealthy bishops lived in comfort while peasants starved. This gap between the ideal of Christian humility and the reality of church power fueled both resentment and, eventually, reformation. Religion, then, was both comfort and control, offering hope while reinforcing social order. It was inescapable, as much a part of daily life as bread or water. With so many shocking truths, filth, hunger, disease, death, and brutal justice, it might seem that medieval life was nothing but misery. But that would be too simple. Humanity, even in its harshest conditions, always finds ways to endure, to laugh, to love, and to celebrate. Festivals were an escape from the grind of survival. Carnivals, religious feasts, and market fairs filled streets with music, dancing, and laughter. People told stories, myths, legends, romances, that transported them to worlds of magic and heroism. Even peasants, weighed down by labor, enjoyed moments of song, drink, and fellowship. Families bonded over shared work. Communities relied on one another for survival, creating ties of loyalty and support. And in the darkest times, during famine, plague, or war, neighbors often came together in solidarity, sharing what little they had. Art, too, blossomed. From illuminated manuscripts to soaring cathedrals, from folk songs to epic poems, medieval people sought beauty during hardship. These creations remind us that while life was cruel, it was also rich, layered, and profoundly human. So, what is the shocking truth about medieval times? It is that life was not the romantic storybook version we so often imagine. It was dirty, dangerous, and often heartbreakingly short. Disease was rampant. Hunger was common. Justice was brutal. Childhood was fragile. And yet, people lived. They endured. They created. They laughed. They dreamed. And they passed on their stories to us. In peeling back the myths, we don't just uncover horror. We uncover resilience. We uncover the depth of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. And now, as you settle deeper into rest, your breathing steady and your mind adrift between waking and sleep, we prepare to step deeper into the world of daily life in the Middle Ages. We'll explore food, clothing, homes, and the rhythms that governed existence from dawn to dusk. We'll see how ordinary people survived, or didn't, in a world so radically different from our own. So, close your eyes a little tighter, let the quiet fill your space, and prepare to walk into the muddy streets, smoky kitchens, and drafty halls of medieval life. This is where the shocking truth truly begins. To truly understand the Middle Ages, one must first grasp the rhythm of life. Unlike today, where electricity extends the day into endless hours, the medieval world was bound tightly to the natural cycle of light and dark. The day began at dawn, often with the crow of a rooster or the ringing of church bells. For peasants, this was the call to labor. Fields needed tilling, animals required tending, and firewood had to be gathered. For townsfolk, workshops opened, ovens were fired, and apprentices bustled to begin their tasks. The wealthy, of course, rose later. A noble household stirred only after the sun had risen, servants scurrying ahead to light fires, fetch water, and prepare meals. Even so, the pace of life remained slower than our own. Without clocks in every home, time was marked loosely by the position of the sun, the tolling of the church bell, or the sounding of horns. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness truly fell. Streets became dangerous, homes dimly lit by smoky candles or flickering hearth-fires. Night was a time of uneasy thieves, wolves, and supernatural fears that prowled the imagination. People went to bed early, wrapped in layers against the cold, hoping to wake up safely with the dawn. For most people, home in the Middle Ages was little more than a single-room hut. Peasants lived in wattle and daub cottages, walls woven from sticks and smeared with mud, straw, and manure for insulation. Roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, a fire hazard waiting to happen. The floor was packed earth, often damp, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that quickly became filthy with food scraps, animal droppings, and pests. Chickens and pigs sometimes lived inside the same space as their owners, providing warmth in winter but also filth and noise. Furniture was minimal: a rough wooden table, a bench or stool, perhaps a chest for storage. Beds, if they existed, were straw-filled sacks shared by entire families. Privacy was non-existent. Noble homes, by contrast, were sturdier but not necessarily comfortable. Castles were impressive from the outside, but inside they were drafty, smoky, and cold. Stone walls absorbed the chill, windows were small and often covered with oiled parchment instead of glass, and fires filled rooms with choking smoke. Rats and lice infested both cottages and castles alike. The shocking truth: whether rich or poor, comfort was a rarity. Even the grandest halls echoed with the same drafts, stench, and vermin as the humblest cottages. If there is one word that defines medieval food for most people, it is scarcity. For peasants, meals revolved around pottages, a thick stew of grains, beans, vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat might occasionally be added. Bread, coarse and dark, was a staple, though flour was often mixed with ground beans or even ground acorns when harvests failed. Meat was rare, usually reserved for feast days or special occasions. In years of bad harvests, famine loomed. Between 1315 and 1317, a catastrophic series of crop failures known as the Great Famine swept across Europe. People resorted to eating dogs, cats, and even corpses. Chronicles speak of cannibalism, parents consuming their own children in desperation. This horror was not the norm, but it reveals how fragile food security truly was. The wealthy fared better, with access to meats, spices, and imported goods. Nobles dined on roasted venison, boar, swan, and peacock. Their tables were piled with pies, pastries, and sauces spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg brought from the east. Wine and ale flowed freely. And yet, even for nobles, food safety was precarious. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Salt and smoke preserved some food, but stomach ailments were common. Banquets dazzled with spectacle, but indigestion and food poisoning lurked beneath the glamour. The shocking truth: most medieval people lived in a state of near constant hunger. Even the privileged lived one failed to harvest away from crisis. What one wore in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of comfort, it was a direct statement of social class. Peasants wore garments made of coarse wool or linen, dyed in muted colors with vegetable or natural dyes. Men typically wore tunics with hose or leggings, while women wore long gowns with aprons and veils. Clothing was patched and repaired until it could no longer be used, then repurposed as rags. Footwear, if owned, was simple leather shoes. Many peasants went barefoot in summer. Nobles, on the other hand, displayed their wealth in fine fabrics, silks, velvets, and furs. Bright colors, especially crimson, purple, and deep blue, were reserved for the wealthy, as the dyes were expensive and difficult to produce. So important was clothing to social hierarchy that sumptuary laws were introduced in many regions. These laws dictated what each class could wear, forbidding peasants from making luxurious fabrics or colors. To dress above one station could result in punishment. But while nobles dressed richly, comfort was not guaranteed. Heavy layers, restrictive gowns, and stiff collars could be cumbersome. Hygiene issues meant that even the finest garments were often crawling with lice. The shocking truth: fashion separated the classes, but no one could escape the discomfort of poor hygiene. Beneath the velvet and silk, lice did not discriminate. For the medieval peasants, life was defined by toil. Men worked the fields from dawn until dusk, plowing, sowing, harvesting. Women labored just as hard, tending animals, preparing meals, spinning wool, weaving cloth, brewing ale, and raising children. Children, too, were part of the workforce. From as young as 5 or 6, they carried water, gathered wood, scared birds from crops, and performed countless chores. The church calendar provided some respite. Feast days, of which there were many, allowed peasants to rest, attend services, and sometimes enjoy a rare bit of merriment. But between these holy days, work was relentless. Nobles worked as well, though in different ways. They oversaw estates, engaged in politics, and trained for warfare. The knight's life was not idle leisure. It required grueling physical training, horsemanship, and constant readiness for battle. Noble women managed large households, directed servants, and handled complex accounts. The shocking truth: idleness was rare for anyone. The stereotype of lazy nobles and backbreaking peasants oversimplifies reality. Work, in one form or another, consumed everyone's life. Perhaps no aspect of medieval life shocks modern minds more than hygiene. Bathing was rare, not because water was unavailable, but because it was believed that excessive bathing weakened the body, opening pores to disease. In some places, public bathhouses existed, but they gained reputation as sites of immorality and the spread of infection. For most people, washing meant wiping one's face and hands with a cloth. Clothes were worn until filthy, then beaten or brushed rather than thoroughly laundered. Human and animal waste often ran through streets or was dumped into rivers, contaminating water sources. The result was an environment rife with disease. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Rats thrived in the filth, spreading plague. Even nobles, with access to perfumes and scented waters, could not mask the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies and refuse. The shocking truth: medieval Europe was, by modern standards, suffocatingly dirty. To walk through a town was to be assaulted by smells of dung, rotting food, smoke, and sweat. And so, the daily life of medieval people was shaped by rhythms of labor, scarcity of food, the discomfort of homes, and the constant presence of dirt and disease. In the next part, we'll go deeper into medicine and health, exploring how people tried to heal in a world without germ theory, and into the superstitions that filled the gaps where science failed. When we think about medicine in the Middle Ages, it is easy to shudder. Modern hospitals, sterile instruments, and antibiotics did not exist. Instead, medical knowledge was based on ancient texts, superstitions, and trial-and-error remedies. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humours, inherited from the writings of the ancient Greek physician Galen. According to this theory, the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, it was believed, occurred when these humours were out of balance. Treatments, therefore, aimed to restore balance. Bloodletting was common. Physicians or barbers used leeches or sharp instruments to draw blood from patients, believing this would remove excess. Purging, vomiting, and sweating were also induced to rebalance the body. Herbal remedies were widely used. Monks in monasteries cultivated herb gardens, using plants like sage, rosemary, and mint for healing. Some herbs genuinely had beneficial effects. Willow bark, for example, contained salicin, a natural pain reliever similar to aspirin. But many cures were useless, or worse, harmful. The shocking truth: medieval medicine was more likely to weaken a patient than to heal them. Yet, it was the best they had, and many clung to it desperately. In a world with few trained physicians, monasteries became centers of healing. Monks copied ancient medical texts, maintained infirmaries, and prepared herbal remedies. Hospitals, when they existed, were often attached to monasteries. But these hospitals were not like modern ones. They were charity places, offering care and shelter more than actual cures. The focus was spiritual as much as physical. Healing the soul through prayer was considered just as important as healing the body. For the poor, this charity was sometimes the only medical care available. Richer nobles might afford private physicians, but even these were bound by the same limited knowledge. Another surprising figure in medieval medicine was the barber surgeon. Barbers were skilled with razors and blades, and so they became the ones to perform minor surgeries, tooth extractions, wound stitching, even amputations. Their shops were marked with the familiar striped pole, a symbol that survives today. The red and white stripes represented blood and bandages. Surgery, however, was brutal. As we know, anesthesia did not exist. At best, patients were given alcohol or opium to dull the pain. Infection was almost guaranteed, as there was no understanding of germs or sterilization. Survival depended on luck, strength, and the body's own resilience. The shocking truth: a trip to the barber could mean a haircut, or a limb being cut off. No discussion of medieval health is complete without the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this devastating pandemic swept through Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The disease, spread by fleas carried on rats, caused swollen lymph nodes, buboes, fever, vomiting, and death within days. Entire villages vanished, cities lost half their populations, and mass graves filled the countryside. Fear gripped the continent. With no understanding of germs, people turned to desperate explanations: divine punishment, bad air, miasma, or the alignment of the planets. Persecution followed. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres. Doctors wore strange plague doctor outfits, long coats, gloves, and masks with beak-like noses filled with herbs and vinegar, meant to protect them from bad air. These costumes look terrifying today, but in truth, they offered little protection. The shocking truth: medieval people lived with the constant shadow of death, never knowing when plague would strike again. Beyond catastrophic plagues, everyday illness was constant. Tooth decay, arthritis, fevers, infections from minor cuts, all were dangerous in a world without antibiotics. Women faced high risks during childbirth, with mortality rates far higher than today. Superstition filled the gaps where medicine failed. Amulets, charms, and prayers were worn to ward off disease. Some believed illness came from sin, so confession and penance were prescribed as cures. Others relied on astrology, consulting the stars to determine when to administer treatment. Even urine was studied. Physicians often examined the color, smell, and taste of a patient's urine, believing it revealed imbalances in the humors. The so-called urine wheel was a diagnostic tool, matching urine shades to specific illnesses. The shocking truth: in many cases, medical experts were little better than fortune tellers, and survival often came down to chance. Medieval society also struggled to understand mental illness. Conditions such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, or depression were often seen as signs of demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatments could be brutal. Some patients were chained, beaten, or subjected to exorcisms. Others might be cared for in monasteries, where prayer and seclusion replaced medical care. The belief in supernatural causes extended to animals as well. Witch marks on livestock, or sudden illness in herds, were blamed on witches. Accusations of witchcraft often followed, with dire consequences for the accused. The shocking truth: without understanding mental health, countless people suffered needlessly, treated as sinners or witches rather than patients. With disease, famine, and injury so common, medieval people lived with death as a constant companion. Cemeteries were everywhere, and churchyards were filled with reminders of mortality. Art reflected this grim reality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and clergy alike to their graves. The message was clear: death spared no one. And yet, life went on. People married, raised children, sang songs, told stories, and found joy where they could. Resilience was as much a part of medieval life as suffering. Medicine and health in the Middle Ages reveal a world caught between faith, superstition, and fragile science. But survival required more than remedies. It demanded resilience in the face of hunger, war, and constant danger. Let us step into the justice system and crime, uncovering how law was enforced, what punishments awaited wrongdoers, and why medieval justice was often as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Medieval Europe was a world without modern police forces or centralized law enforcement. Instead, justice was enforced through a mixture of local customs, feudal authority, and church influence. Maintaining order was a constant struggle, especially in an era where personal honor, land disputes, and petty theft could ignite deadly conflicts. Each region had its own system, but across Europe, the general principle was the same. Punishment was public, brutal, and meant to discourage others from breaking the law. The shocking truth: medieval justice was less about fairness and more about fear. One of the most notorious features of medieval law was the trial by ordeal. Since evidence was hard to gather and witnesses could be unreliable, guilt or innocence was often determined by subjecting the accused to a dangerous test and letting God decide the outcome. There were several forms of ordeal. Ordeal by fire: the accused would carry a red-hot iron a certain distance or plunge a hand into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly after a set number of days, they were declared innocent. If they festered, guilt was proven. Ordeal by water: the accused was tied and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty, since water, considered pure, rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, though drowning was often the result. Ordeal by combat: disputes between nobles were sometimes settled by a duel. The idea was that God would grant victory to the righteous party. These trials were deeply terrifying, but they reflected the era's belief that divine will governs human affairs. The shocking truth: survival often had little to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with luck. If found guilty, criminals faced punishments designed not just to correct, but to terrify others into obedience. These punishments varied by crime, class, and region, but they shared one thing in common: brutality. For minor crimes, fines could be imposed, or the criminal might be locked in the stocks, a wooden frame that trapped the hands and head, leaving them exposed to public ridicule and abuse. Thieves were often whipped publicly or branded with hot irons, leaving permanent scars as a warning to others. Repeat offenders could have ears, noses, or hands cut off. A thief without a hand could not steal again. For serious crimes like murder, treason, or heresy, execution was the ultimate punishment. Methods included hanging, burning at the stake, beheading, and, in extreme cases, drawing and quartering. Executions were public events, drawing huge crowds. They were meant to demonstrate the power of authority and the consequences of disobedience. The shocking truth: punishment was entertainment, with entire communities gathering to watch people suffer and die. Justice was also shaped by the feudal hierarchy. Nobles often had their own courts to deal with disputes among their vassals and peasants. This meant laws were not applied equally. A noble who committed a crime might be fined or lose land, while a peasant might be whipped or executed for the same offense. Justice was often skewed in favor of the powerful. The church, too, had its own courts, which handled cases of morality, marriage disputes, and heresy. Clergy accused of crimes were often tried in church courts, where punishments were typically lighter. This benefit of clergy gave churchmen significant protection. The shocking truth: justice depended as much on who you were as on what you did. Crime was rampant, and survival sometimes drove people to desperate acts. Common crimes included hunger and poverty have made stealing food or livestock a constant issue. Forests and game were often reserved for nobles, so peasants caught hunting illegally faced severe punishments. With few police and long stretches of unguarded roads, travelers were vulnerable to bands of robbers. Beliefs outside accepted church doctrine could be treated as crimes, punishable by death. Urban areas, with their growing populations, also saw rising crime rates. Towns developed watchmen and curfews, but these measures did little to stop determined criminals. The shocking truth: lawbreakers were everywhere, and ordinary people lived with constant fear of theft, violence, or false accusation. Contrary to modern belief, medieval prisons were not usually meant as long-term punishments. Instead, they were holding places until trial or execution. Dungeons beneath castles were cold, dark, and infested with rats. Prisoners might be chained to walls, deprived of food, or tortured to extract confessions. Torture devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or the thumbscrew became infamous symbols of medieval cruelty. But torture was not used only in dungeons. It was sometimes applied in open courts to ensure truth was spoken. Confessions extracted under agony were treated as valid evidence. The shocking truth: justice was often less about truth and more about terror and control. The medieval church preached forgiveness, but it also played a central role in punishment. Heretics, those who rejected official doctrine, faced harsh consequences. The Inquisition, established in the 12th century, sought out and punished heresy with imprisonment, torture, and execution. Public penance was also common. A sinner might be forced to wear distinctive clothing, walk barefoot through the streets, or perform humiliating acts to demonstrate repentance. In many ways, the church reinforced fear as a tool of social control. Obedience to God and to earthly rulers was not optional. It was enforced with fire and sword. To modern eyes, medieval justice appears horrifyingly unfair. Trials by ordeal were random, punishments were cruel, and the poor suffered far more harshly than the rich. But for medieval people, these systems provided order in a chaotic world. Justice was less about fairness and more about maintaining stability. Fear of punishment, divine or earthly, kept many from rebelling or committing crimes. The shocking truth: medieval law and punishment reveal a society where fear was a constant companion, and where survival often meant enduring both crime and the justice meant to stop it. We have now seen how medicine, superstition, and law shaped everyday life. But there is another layer of medieval experience, one rooted in faith, power, and the clash of kingdoms. Now, we'll explore religion and war, how faith dominated every aspect of life, how crusades reshaped the world, and how knights and kings lived in a constant cycle of battle and belief. To truly understand the Middle Ages, one must recognize how deeply religion permeated every aspect of existence. Christianity was not just a faith but the very foundation of law, culture, and daily routine. From the humblest peasant to the most powerful king, the church's influence was inescapable. Bells rang from churches and monasteries, marking hours of prayer. Ordinary people structured their days around these calls, attending Mass whenever possible. Nearly 1/3 of the year was dedicated to religious observances. These holidays broke the monotony of labor and gave peasants rare moments of joy. Eternal damnation was a constant worry. Sermons warned of hellfire, and confession was seen as the only path to salvation. The shocking truth: the church did not just guide spiritual life, it controlled education, medicine, morality, and even politics. The medieval church was the most powerful institution in Europe. Popes could excommunicate kings, essentially declaring them enemies of God. Monasteries accumulated vast wealth, and cathedrals rose as monumental symbols of spiritual and political might. Every household owed 1/10 of its earnings to the church. This tax ensured constant income, even during times of famine. The church became one of the largest landowners in Europe. Vast estates, abbeys, and monasteries supported entire economies. The church controlled universities and literacy. Most books were written by monks, and teachings were filtered through theology. The shocking truth: questioning the church was not only dangerous, it was often fatal. Heretics were burned at the stake, and entire movements that challenged church authority were crushed. Religion did not remain confined to churches. It also fueled wars that shaped continents. The Crusades, beginning in the 11th century, were military campaigns declared by the Pope to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Knights were promised forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation if they fought. For many, this was irresistible. Others joined for wealth, land, or adventure. Crusaders faced grueling journeys, disease, and starvation. Battles were brutal, and atrocities were committed by both sides. While the Crusades failed to establish permanent Christian control of Jerusalem, they opened Europe to new trade, ideas, and cultural exchange. The shocking truth: what began as religious devotion often became an excuse for plunder, conquest, and mass slaughter. Knights are often imagined as noble warriors, clad in shining armor, defending the weak. But the reality was far grittier. Boys destined for knighthood began as pages, then squires, serving noble households. Training was harsh, involving combat practice, horse riding, and learning courtly manners. A knight's armor could weigh over 60 pounds. Weapons included swords, lances, and maces. Battle required immense strength and stamina. The code of chivalry promoted ideals of honor, loyalty, and protection of the church. But in practice, knights often looted, killed civilians, and acted as enforcers for their lords. The shocking truth: knights were as feared as they were admired. For peasants, they were not fairy tale heroes, but heavily armed men who could bring ruin as easily as protection. Medieval kings ruled with claims of divine right, the belief that God himself appointed them. But in practice, their power was constantly challenged. Feudal lords often resisted royal control, leading to endless power struggles. Castles were both homes and military strongholds, built to withstand sieges. Kings sought to expand their territories through conquest. The 100 Years' War between England and France is a prime example of dynastic struggle and national rivalry. To finance wars, kings raised taxes. For peasants already living at the edge of survival, this was devastating. The shocking truth: medieval politics was a brutal game of power, where the ambitions of kings and nobles cost thousands of common lives. Faith and warfare were deeply intertwined. Soldiers marched into battle carrying relics of saints, believing divine protection would shield them. Victories were often attributed to God's favor, while defeats were seen as punishment for sin. Yet superstition also played a role. Soldiers carried charms, prayed to patron saints, and sought blessings before combat. The boundary between faith and fear was thin. The shocking truth: war was not only fought with swords, but also with prayers, relics, and a belief that heaven or hell hovered over every battlefield. While knights and kings clashed, ordinary people bore the heaviest burden. Armies marching through villages seized food, burned crops, and destroyed homes. Peasants were often caught between rival forces, suffering violence from both sides. Famine, plague, and taxation followed wars like shadows. Many villages never recovered from the devastation of repeated conflicts. The shocking truth: for most medieval people, war was not about glory or honor. It was a nightmare of hunger, fear, and destruction. We have now explored the daily realities of medieval life: the dirt and disease, the strange medicine, the brutal justice, and the overwhelming influence of religion and war. But this is only the beginning. We will turn to the darkest secrets and shocking truths of medieval society, delving into hidden practices, forbidden beliefs, and the parts of history often left out of romanticized tales. When we think of medieval history, most records come from churches, royal courts, and wealthy monasteries. These institutions wanted to present an ordered, godly world ruled by faith and hierarchy. But the reality beneath was far murkier. For every sermon preached in a cathedral, there were whispered superstitions in cottages. For every knight in shining armor, there were mercenaries looting villages. And for every pious prayer, there was secret rebellion, heresy, or hidden belief that defied the authority of the age. The shocking truth is that the medieval world was filled with contradictions. People feared the wrath of God but also trusted in charms and spells. The church preached purity but was often steeped in corruption and vice. Histories written by monks left out the darker sides of daily life, but archaeology, folklore, and overlooked chronicles reveal a more complex, often unsettling picture. In this part, we step into those shadows, exploring superstition, witchcraft, heresy, and the secret lives that existed beyond official history. Despite the church's dominance, medieval people lived in a world thick with superstition. Illness, storms, crop failure, and sudden death were explained not by science, but by hidden forces, demons, witches, curses, or divine punishment. People carried amulets, bones of animals, or small pouches filled with herbs believed to ward off evil. A common charm was a piece of iron, thought to repel spirits. Newborns were bathed with special herbs, animals were blessed, and houses were sprinkled with holy water to keep away demons. The medieval night was terrifying. With no streetlights, the darkness seemed alive with spirits. People feared wandering alone, believing ghosts and demons prowled after sunset. The shocking truth, though priests condemned these practices as pagan, even churchmen were not immune to superstition. Bishops carried relics into battle, and monks recorded strange omens in their chronicles. While the full-scale witch hunts of Europe came later, the Middle Ages already carried deep suspicion of magic and witchcraft. In villages, wise women and healers practiced herbal medicine, midwifery, and simple charms. Many were respected, but when misfortune struck, a sick cow, a dead child, a failed harvest, they could quickly be accused of consorting with dark forces. Ironically, church rituals often resembled magic to ordinary people. Holy water, relics, blessings, and exorcisms. The line between sanctioned ritual and forbidden magic was thin. Those accused of witchcraft faced brutal consequences. They could be tried, tortured, and executed. But often, accusations masked deeper tensions, jealousy, land disputes, or fear of powerful women. The shocking truth, witchcraft accusations often revealed more about community fears and power struggles than about actual sorcery. The greatest threat to the medieval church was not witches but heretics, groups that openly rejected church teachings. In southern France, the Cathars preached a form of Christianity that rejected the authority of Rome. They believed in living simply and condemned the wealth of the church. The church responded with the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, a brutal war that wiped out entire towns. Followers of Peter Waldo, this group emphasized poverty and direct reading of Scripture. They were declared heretics for refusing to submit to church authority. In England, the followers of John Wycliffe pushed for vernacular Bibles and questioned the corruption of the clergy. They were persecuted, but their ideas would later inspire the Reformation. The shocking truth, heretics were often ordinary people seeking honesty and faith. Their brutal suppression shows how fiercely the medieval church guarded its power. Books were rare and precious, copied by hand in a monastery. But some texts were considered dangerous. Though sometimes tolerated, these practices were often viewed with suspicion. Kings and nobles secretly consulted astrologers, even as the church condemned them. The Bible was kept in Latin, accessible only to the clergy. Translating it into local languages was considered heresy. Yet secret translations circulated, often at great risk. A few rare manuscripts dealt with spells, charms, or hidden sciences. Some monks dabbled in such studies, writing in codes to avoid persecution. The shocking truth, even within monasteries, curiosity about forbidden knowledge thrived, suggesting that the thirst for hidden wisdom never truly disappeared. While priests preached purity and moral order, the medieval church was not free of corruption. People could pay money to reduce time in purgatory. This practice enriched the church but left the poor feeling cheated. Many priests broke vows of celibacy, keeping mistresses, or even fathering children. Some lived in wealth far removed from their flocks. Though monasteries were meant for prayer and simplicity, some became centers of luxury, feasting, and political intrigue. The shocking truth, ordinary believers often saw the gap between preaching and practice, breeding resentment that would later explode in reform movements. We have uncovered the first layers of medieval society's hidden life: superstition, witchcraft, heresy, and corruption within the church itself. These truths reveal a world not only shaped by faith and duty, but also by fear, suspicion, and rebellion. Let us go deeper into crime, vice, sexuality, and the underground cultures of the Middle Ages, exploring the hidden realities that official records tried to erase. Medieval life was not as orderly as chronicles suggest. Laws were strict, punishments brutal, but crime thrived everywhere. From the streets of London to small villages, people lived with constant fear of theft, banditry, and violence. Forests across Europe were home to outlaws. Some, like the legendary Robin Hood, were romanticized, but most were brutal thieves preying on travelers. Roads were dangerous, and even merchants traveled in armed groups. As cities grew, so did gangs. Records from medieval London, Paris, and Florence describe knife fights, burglaries, and assaults. Many criminals melted into the crowded streets, hidden in slums and taverns. Justice was harsh. Thieves could be hanged for stealing bread, while nobles often escaped punishment for far worse crimes. Stocks, whipping, branding, and mutilation were used as public warnings. The shocking truth: crime was not the exception. It was part of daily life, showing how fragile law and order truly were in the medieval world. Despite the moral preaching of the church, medieval towns and cities had thriving underworlds of gambling, brothels, and taverns. Far from being rare, prostitution was widespread. Some towns even had red light districts where sex work was tolerated, if not officially regulated. Brothels catered to merchants, students, and soldiers. The church condemned it publicly but often looked the other way, since it kept greater sins at bay. Dice games and betting were popular, especially among young men and soldiers. Authorities banned gambling repeatedly, but the thrill of chance made it impossible to stop. Drinking was central to medieval social life. Alehouses were places of relaxation but also of brawls, theft, and disorder. Chroniclers often complained of drunkenness as a major problem. The shocking truth: the so-called Holy Age of Faith was also an age of vice, where hidden pleasures coexisted with public morality. Sex in the Middle Ages is often imagined as repressed by religion, but the reality was complex. Premarital and extramarital affairs, though condemned, were common. Court records reveal countless cases of adultery, seduction, and broken promises of marriage. Homosexuality was officially condemned as a grave sin, but it nevertheless existed across all levels of society. In some medieval courts, records of trials against men, and sometimes women, accused of same-sex relationships survive, showing that while punished, such behavior was far from unknown. Clergy and sexual scandals. Despite vows of celibacy, many priests and monks engaged in sexual relationships. Some monasteries gained reputations for scandal, even housing secret families. The church wrote obsessively about sins of the flesh, listing forbidden acts in great detail, ironically revealing how widespread they must have been. The shocking truth: medieval sexuality was far more diverse and active than official sermons suggested, hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. Women's voices were often silenced in official chronicles, but their hidden roles were vital, and sometimes shocking by the standards of their age. Noble women managed estates while husbands were at war. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, wielded enormous political influence. Others quietly steered village life through markets, family ties, and church networks. Records reveal women involved in theft, fraud, and even violent crime. Some became notorious criminals, though many faced harsher punishment than men for the same offenses. Women who practiced medicine, especially in childbirth, were sometimes celebrated but also at risk of being accused of witchcraft if things went wrong. Men's sexual sins were often excused, but women accused of immorality faced ruin. A woman branded unchaste could lose her reputation, property, and even her life. The shocking truth: medieval women lived under heavy restrictions, yet many found ways to wield influence, both openly and in hidden ways. Medieval history often focuses on kings, knights, and clergy, But most people were peasants, laborious, and beggars, whose struggles were rarely recorded. Cities were filled with beggars, many disabled or orphaned by war and famine. Authorities tried to control begging, but charity was also seen as a Christian duty. Lepers, the disabled, and others considered unclean were often forced to live at the edge of society. Lepers' hospitals existed, but fear of disease made these people both pitted and shunned. The poor sometimes turned to theft, prostitution, or wandering as ways to survive. Seasonal migration for work was common. Archaeology shows many peasants buried without markers, their names lost to history, while kings and nobles had elaborate tombs. The shocking truth: for most medieval people, life was short, harsh, and anonymous, a stark contrast to the romanticized stories of chivalry. Now, we will explore the medieval obsession with death, the macabre, and the supernatural. From plague rituals to ghost stories and bizarre burial practices that reveal how deeply people feared the afterlife. In the medieval world, death was never far away. It lingered in the fields during famine years, it whispered through towns when plague arrived, and it waited quietly in the shadows of every household, where even a small wound or fever could turn fatal. People did not try to hide from this reality. Instead, they lived alongside it. Villagers buried loved ones in small churchyards where sheep grazed and wildflowers grew. Children played among gravestones, monks sang prayers for the dead morning and night, and families spoke openly of the souls of their ancestors. It is hard for us, in the modern age, to imagine living so close to death. But for them, it was a daily companion, both terrifying and strangely comforting. The most haunting example came in the mid-14th century, when the plague known as the Black Death swept across Europe. Entire villages emptied, fields went untended, and the silence of grief fell over bustling cities. Chroniclers wrote that bodies lay in the streets, while bells tolled endlessly for the dead. In some towns, survivors fled, abandoning family and neighbors. In others, communities bound together, digging mass graves where priests whispered hurried prayers before moving on to the next burial. The shocking truth is that during those years, death became almost ordinary, a presence so overwhelming that people learned to live, sleep, and even laugh beside it. And yet, out of this darkness, new rituals of remembrance were born. The Dance of Death, painted on church walls, reminded people that kings and beggars alike would one day join the same eternal procession. It might seem strange to us that medieval people decorated their churches with skeletons, skulls, and vivid scenes of decay. But for them, this was not horror. It was a form of reassurance. To look upon a carved skeleton in stone was to remember that death came for everyone, and thus there was no shame in being mortal. It was, in a sense, democratic. Graveyards themselves were social places. Pilgrims visited the tombs of saints, children played around the monuments, and villagers gathered on holy days to light candles for their ancestors. To sit among the dead was to be reminded of life's fragility and its beauty. The medieval imagination was alive with stories of spirits who lingered after death. Some were gentle, returning to ask loved ones for prayers or to warn them of danger. Others were unsettling, described as shadowy figures wandering crossroads of fields, unable to rest because of sins left unconfessed. Monks recorded tales of souls appearing in cloisters, begging for alms to be given in their name. Villagers spoke of strange lights flickering in graveyards. The boundary between the living and the dead felt thinner, softer, as though the two worlds touched. It is easy to see why, in a time when death was everywhere, it seemed natural that the souls of the departed might linger close by. These stories were not told only to frighten. They were also reminders that the dead were never truly gone. They remained part of the living community. The way medieval people treated their dead was shaped by both faith and fear. In small villages, burials were simple, the body wrapped in cloth and lowered into the earth. In cities, great stone tombs marked the graves of nobles, their carved effigies lying in eternal rest with hands folded in prayer. In monasteries, monks lay side by side in long rows, their lives of service mirrored in their communal rest. Sometimes, however, burial practices reveal anxieties. Archaeologists have found skeletons weighed down with stones or buried face down, as if to prevent the dead from rising again. These rare but striking examples speak of a deeper fear, that the boundary between life and death might not hold. During the Black Death, rituals of mourning took on urgent new forms. Mass graves were dug, often without coffins, and bodies were laid together with quick prayers. Processions of flagellants, men who whipped themselves in penance, walked barefoot from town to town, believing that their suffering might ease God's anger. The sight of these processions was eerie. Long lines of pale figures, chanting hymns in the twilight, their backs streaked with blood. To the people who watched, it was a moment both terrifying and strangely hopeful, a desperate attempt to bring order to chaos. Amid all this, the afterlife was not only feared but longed for. Heaven was described in glowing detail, gardens filled with flowers, endless light, and the joyful reunion of families. The idea that suffering on earth might give way to eternal peace made death easier to bear. Hell, too, was described with vivid imagination. Preachers painted pictures of fire, demons, and endless torment. These sermons frightened people, but they also gave shape to their anxieties. To imagine hell was to feel a kind of control, to put chaos into a story that could be told and understood. Purgatory, the space in between, became perhaps the most relatable idea of all. A place of cleansing, where souls slowly worked off their sins, it reassured people that even imperfection did not mean eternal damnation. Prayers for the dead, candles lit in chapels, and masses said in memory of loved ones were all acts of love, meant to ease this journey. The shocking truth is that medieval people did not hide from death. They embraced it, surrounded themselves with reminders of it, and in doing so, gave themselves the strength to endure. Their rituals, their art, their ghost stories, and their prayers reveal a society that looked into the darkness without turning away. And perhaps, in a strange way, that acceptance gave them peace. As we drift further into the shadows of medieval life, we will next turn to the world of witches, heretics, and forbidden magic. In Part 4, we'll step into the eerie glow of candlelit rituals, whispered spells, and the terrifying hunts that sought to root out anything seen as unholy. It is a world both chilling and strangely beautiful, one where belief and fear intertwined in ways that shaped centuries of history. As twilight fell on medieval villages, the world seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened across wooden cottages, owls stirred in the rafters, and the crackle of firelight drew people close. But beyond the warmth of the hearth, there lingered whispers of something darker, a belief that hidden forces moved unseen through the night. The medieval mind was filled with mysteries. Faith explained much of life, but there were always questions unanswered. Why did storms suddenly tear through fields? Why did crops wither without reason? Why did some people heal quickly, while others lingered in illness? For many, the answer was simple. Unseen powers, both good and evil, shaped the world. And to touch these powers, people turned to charms, prayers, and, sometimes, the dangerous paths of forbidden magic. Before the word which became a curse, there were the cunning folk. These were local healers, men and women who blended herbal remedies with whispered prayers. They brewed teas for fevers, salves for wounds, and charms for protection. They whispered blessings over newborns, tied knotted strings to ease childbirth, and muttered words to calm restless livestock. To the people of their villages, they were not feared but sought out, especially when no priest or physician could help. Yet, their craft walked a fine line. For in every healing charm, there lingered the suspicion of something darker. If a spell could bring good, might it also bring harm? And so admiration mingled with unease, and trust with quiet doubt. The Church, ever watchful, drew sharp lines between holy miracles and dangerous sorcery. A saint's relic curing a fever was a gift of God. A healer's herb is working too well? That might be the devil's trick. This tension grew sharper with time. While some priests tolerated local charms, others thundered against them from the pulpit. Books were written warning that demons lurked behind spells, that those who whispered incantations risked not only their souls but their entire community. By the late Middle Ages, suspicion turned into fear. What had once been seen as folk wisdom became dangerous, branded as witchcraft. To speak of witches in the medieval world is to enter a place of both myth and reality. At first, the idea of witches was more symbolic than real. warnings in sermons, shadows in stories told by firelight. Witches were imagined as women flying through the night, meeting in secret gatherings, or whispering with dark spirits. But as fear spread, accusation began to take root. A sick cow, a sudden death, a spoil harvest, these misfortunes sometimes spark suspicion. Fingers pointed toward the outsider, the widow who lived alone, the woman with knowledge of herbs, the man whose strange words unsettled neighbors. Accusations could grow into trials. In small villages, this often meant little more than public shame or penance. But in certain places, as belief hardened, punishments grew harsher, and the word which became one of the most dangerous accusations one could face. Witches were feared for their supposed power, but heretics were feared for something even more dangerous, their ideas. To question the church in the medieval world was to question the very foundation of society. Faith was not only personal, it shaped laws, kingship, and daily life. To stray from accepted belief was seen as a threat to order itself. The shocking truth is that heresy was often born not of rebellion, but of longing. Many heretical groups sought purity, simplicity, and closeness to God. Yet, their rejection of the church's authority marked them as dangerous. Trials were held. Books were burned. Inquisitors traveled across Europe, listening to whispers of dissent. The punishments could be severe: imprisonment, exile, or even execution. And so, a world that dreamed of light often found itself wrapped in shadows of fear. Despite the dangers, belief in magic ran through medieval life like an underground stream. Their amulets were worn to ward off illness, or a knife placed under the bed was thought to protect a mother in childbirth. Words carved on parchment and slipped into a pocket promised safety on long journeys. Even the highest ranks of society were not immune. Kings and queens consulted astrologers to guide their choices, while knights carried charms into battle. What the church condemned, people still quietly practiced, because fear and hope often walked hand in hand. By the later Middle Ages, the fear of witches grew into waves of trials. Communities turned inward, seeking explanations for their suffering. Or if a storm destroyed crops, perhaps someone would curse the fields. Or if a child is sickened, perhaps a neighbor will whisper with dark powers. The accused might be questioned harshly, pressed to confess. Sometimes, under unbearable pressure, they admitted to things they had never done, telling stories of midnight gatherings and unholy pacts. These confessions fed the fear, and so the cycle deepened. Though the great witch hunts would rise most fiercely in the centuries to come, the seeds were sown in these medieval fears. The whisper of a curse was enough to ruin lives, enough to make neighbors turn against one another. The shocking truth is this: medieval people lived in a world where faith and fear coexisted. They prayed by candlelight, yet tucked charms beneath their pillows. They believed in saints, but also in the whispers of spirits. They honored the church but quietly sought the aid of cunning folk. This blending of belief did not make their world weaker, it made it profoundly human. For in their struggle to make sense of misfortune, they turned to every source of comfort they could find, from the holy to the hidden. As we look back now, from the calm of our beds, the world of witches and heretics, charms and trials, might seem distant. And yet, it reveals something eternal: the human heart's search for meaning in mystery, for light in the dark. Their fears were real, their hopes tender, their choices shaped by a world that felt both enchanted and perilous. And in their lives, we glimpse the timeless dance between reason and wonder, between faith and doubt. We will explore the shocking truth of medieval power and politics, the hidden games of kings and queens, the intrigue of courts, and the struggles that shaped nations. But before we go there, let us rest a moment in the quiet, remembering how the medieval world held its secrets close, whispering them softly into the night. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine mighty kings sitting upon thrones of gold, commanding armies with a single word, their crowns gleaming beneath vaulted ceilings. Queens, robed in silks, walk with grace through candlelit halls. Castles rise high against the sky, their banners fluttering in the wind. But the shocking truth is that medieval power was rarely so simple, rarely so secure. Behind the glitter of crowns lay a constant struggle: whispers of betrayal, rival claims, restless nobles, and even hungry peasants pressing from below. A king might wear a crown, but it was often heavy with fear. A queen might walk with dignity, but her steps were often watched, measured, and controlled. Power was not a single throne but a web, fragile and full of hidden knots. Kingship in the medieval world was both sacred and precarious. On one hand, kings were seen as chosen by God, anointed with holy oils during their coronation. Their authority was wrapped in divine mystery. On the other hand, their rule depended on loyalty. Loyalty from nobles who commanded armies, from bishops who swayed faith, from towns that held wealth. If any thread of that loyalty snapped, the king's power could unravel. History is full of such stories. Kings are deposed by ambitious brothers. Monarchs were weakened by famine and rebellion. Crowns passed not with peace, but with blood. To be king was to live constantly in the shadow of loss. Queens held power of a different kind. Often, their authority did not come from the throne itself, but from the alliances they forged. Marriage was not only about love. In fact, it was rarely about love. It was politics written in vows. Marriage might secure peace between rival kingdoms. A bride's dowry could fund armies or castles. A queen's children, especially sons, became the threads that tied dynasties together. But behind this dignity lay personal sacrifice. A young girl, sometimes barely a teenager, might be sent across seas or mountains to wed a man she had never met. She left her family, her language, her homeland, to play her part on the vast stage of medieval politics. Some queens rose above these limits, becoming influential advisors, even rulers in their own right. Others were silenced, their lives confined to the shadows of courtly halls. Power was not only in crowns and thrones. Behind the visible rulers moved invisible hands, advisors and counselors, who whispered strategies in the king's ear. Clergy, who shaped not only faith but politics, for a bishop's blessing could steady a throne. Merchants, who funded wars with silver and gold, made kings dependent on trade. Nobles, who commanded their own castles and armies, were often as powerful as the king himself. A ruler could not act alone. Every choice, to go to war, to raise taxes, to pass laws, required negotiation, persuasion, and sometimes bribes. The court was not a place of absolute command, but a delicate dance of power. The medieval world was filled with stories of betrayal. A trusted knight might turn rebel. A cousin might lay claim to the throne. A noble might secretly ally with an enemy. Kings and queens often lived surrounded by suspicion. Poison was feared at feasts, daggers in the dark at banquets. Even family could not always be trusted. Brothers became rivals, sons rose against fathers, and wives were accused of treachery. The shocking truth is that many medieval rulers slept uneasily, their crowns heavy not only with jewels but with dread. And then, at the bottom of the pyramid, stood the people, peasants, townsfolk, soldiers. They had little power in law, but when hunger or anger grew, they became impossible to ignore. Riots broke out over rising taxes. Revolts spread when harvests failed. Armies of common folk sometimes marched, shaking the very foundations of kingdoms. Though kings ruled by divine rights, they were bound by the realities of food, land, and loyalty. Without the support of their people, their thrones became little more than fragile chairs. So, as we imagine the medieval crown glittering in the candlelight, let us remember the truth. It was not a symbol of certainty, but of constant struggle. Kings ruled not as gods upon earth, but as fragile figures caught in webs of duty, fear, and chance. Queens carried not only jewels but the weight of dynasties, their lives traded in the politics of marriage. And behind them, unseen but ever present, moved counselors, nobles, clergy, merchants, and the restless hum of the people themselves. Power in the medieval world was never a single voice. It was a chorus, sometimes harmonious, sometimes filled with discord. We will move deeper into this web of medieval politics, exploring the shocking truths of betrayal, warfare, and the silent hands that shaped kingdoms from the shadows. But for now, rest in the image of a king upon his throne, golden, yes, but heavy, fragile, and forever uncertain. If the crown was heavy, then the throne itself was often unsteady. Few rulers in the Middle Ages could rest without fear of rivals. A king's word might be law, but law could bend beneath the weight of ambition. Brothers quarreled over inheritance. Sons rebelled against their fathers. Nobles gathered in secret councils, plotting whether to serve or to strike. And beyond the borders, rival kings watched closely, waiting for weakness to show. The shocking truth is that medieval thrones were rarely secure. They were more like precarious perches upon shifting ground. A single defeat in battle, a single rumor of weakness, could send the crown tumbling to another head. One of the most unsettling truths of medieval politics is how often blood was spilled within families. Dynasties, which should have united kingdoms, often tore them apart. In England, the Wars of the Roses turned cousins into bitter enemies, each side claiming the right to the throne. In the Holy Roman Empire, rival brothers waged endless contests for supremacy, dragging entire regions into their quarrels. In France, disputes over succession led to devastating wars that spread across Europe. A royal family was not always a bond of loyalty. It was often a nest of ambition, where each member measured their own chances at power. Betrayal was the language of politics. A trusted knight might secretly change sides in the night. A noble might pledge loyalty with one hand and prepare rebellion with the other. Even allies forged in marriage could turn into foes. Kings often lived surrounded by suspicion. They relied on food tasters to guard against poison, guards to protect them in their chambers, and spies to keep watch on the whispers of the court. Yet still, betrayals slipped through. Feasts ended in bloodshed. Councils dissolved into plots. A ruler could never fully trust even those closest to them. War was not only about defense or conquest. It was often the tool by which rulers proved their right to reign. A young king might need to lead his army to show strength. A noble might rebel to prove that the crown was weak. A queen might urge her husband into battle to secure her children's inheritance. Wars were costly, both in coin and in lives. But they were also necessary performances. To appear weak was dangerous. A crown that did not gleam with victories soon lost its shine. The shocking truth is that kings were often trapped by the very wars they waged. Victories might bring glory, but defeats could end dynasties. While swords clashed on the fields, another battle unfolded in the courts. This was a quieter war, fought with whispers, alliances, gifts, and promises. Courtiers competed for the king's ear. Bishops pressed for favor. Nobles sought to advance their children into positions of influence. The court was a stage where every gesture, every word, could shift fortunes. And always, there was the risk of scandal. A rumor could destroy a reputation. A whispered word of treachery could lead to exile, or worse, execution. The court was not only a place of splendor. It was a dangerous theater, where smiles often hid daggers. Queens often played vital roles in these struggles. Some were skilled diplomats, weaving alliances with words and letters. Others became pawns, caught between the ambitions of men. But many queens learned to survive by mastering the art of quiet influence. Through patronage, friendship, and counsel, they steered the tides of politics. Still, their position was perilous. A queen accused of disloyalty or infidelity could be cast aside, even executed. Their power, though real, was always fragile. Beneath the surface glitter of crowns and courts lay a heavy cost. Rulers lived with constant anxiety, watching for betrayal, fearing rebellion, calculating each decision with care. Their families were rarely safe. Sons were raised not only as children but as potential rivals. Daughters were sent away in marriage, their fates tied to distant lands. And always, war hovered nearby, demanding soldiers, coins, and blood. The shocking truth is that medieval rulers, though powerful in appearance, often lived lives filled with fear, sacrifice, and ceaseless struggle. As we picture the great feasting halls and the banners flying above castles, let us also see the shadows that linger there. Every feast might hide betrayal. Every alliance might crumble. Every throne was fragile, balanced upon the shifting sands of loyalty and ambition. The medieval crown was not simply a jewel of power. It was a burden, a gamble, a constant contest to remain upon the throne. In the next part, we will turn our gaze to the clergy and the church, forces that shaped kings, guided queens, and sometimes toppled crowns altogether. Their influence was vast, their authority both spiritual and political. For now, close your eyes and rest with the image of a throne standing tall, glittering, yes, but trembling beneath the weight of unending struggles. When we imagine medieval life, the church often comes cloaked in incense and hymns, a place of prayer, of confession, of candles glowing in quiet chapels. And yes, it was all of this. But to see only this is to miss the deeper truth. The church was not only a spiritual guide. It was a vast political force, rivaling even kings. Its leaders did not merely whisper prayers. They commanded armies of thought, wealth, and loyalty. They could sanctify a king, or strip him of legitimacy with a single pronouncement. This is one of the most shocking truths. The medieval crown did not always rest upon the will of nobles or the strength of armies. It also rested on the blessing, or the curse, of the church. In Rome sat a man whose voice carried across all of Christendom, the Pope. To the faithful, he was the shepherd of souls. But politically, he was far more, a ruler without borders, a monarch whose kingdom was belief itself. If a king angered the Pope, he risked excommunication. This was no mere insult. Excommunication meant that the king was cast outside the church, denied its sacraments, its blessings, even its prayers. To his subjects, this was terrifying. How could they obey a ruler damned by the very church that held the keys to heaven? Some kings bowed their heads in humility when threatened. Others resisted, sparking great clashes between the crown and papacy. One of the most striking examples comes from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. In the late 11th century, he quarreled bitterly with Pope Gregory VII over who had the right to appoint bishops, the king, or the Pope. The Pope excommunicated Henry, stripping him of legitimacy. Nobles turned against him. His throne trembled. In desperation, Henry traveled across the Alps in the dead of winter to seek forgiveness. At the fortress of Canossa, he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging the Pope to lift the curse. The image of an emperor kneeling in the cold before a pope reveals just how immense the church's power truly was. The church was not only powerful in spirit, it was wealthy beyond measure. Monasteries held vast tracts of land, richer than many noble estates. Cathedrals drew offerings from the faithful, their coffers swelling with coins. Tithes, a tenth of every peasant harvest, flowed into the church year after year. With this wealth, the church built stone giants that still rise above medieval towns, cathedrals that soared to the heavens, their spires a reminder of both God's glory and the church's might. But wealth also meant influence. Bishops lent money to kings. Abbots advised rulers. A monarch who sought favor with the church often found himself surrounded by clerics at court. It may seem surprising, but many of the great statesmen of the Middle Ages wore robes rather than armor. Bishops acted as royal counselors, drafting laws and treaties. Monks, skilled in writing, served as record keepers, treasurers, and ambassadors. Some cardinals commanded armies in battle, carrying both swords and a cross. The church blurred the line between the sacred and the political. A king might wear a crown, but his closest advisors often wore the cross. Another shocking truth is how deeply the church controlled not only actions but also thoughts. The Inquisition, established to root out heresy, gave the church immense power to investigate and punish those who strayed from accepted beliefs. A noble accused of heresy might lose land and title. A scholar might be silenced for challenging doctrine. Ordinary villagers might live in fear of being reported for unorthodox prayers or strange ideas. This was not only a spiritual concern, it was political. Thinking wrongly could be treated as a threat to the order of the realm. Few events reveal the church's power more than the Crusades. With a call from the Pope, knights from across Europe marched east to reclaim the Holy Land. Here, faith and politics were woven together. Kings gained prestige by taking the cross. Nobles sought wealth and land. The church blessed the wars, promising salvation to those who fought. The Crusades reshaped kingdoms, drained treasuries, and redrew maps. They were not only spiritual ventures, they were deeply political, giving the church power to guide entire continents into war. Kings often found themselves torn. They needed the church's blessing to appear legitimate, yet they also feared being bound by it. A king might wish to tax church lands, only to face resistance. A queen might rely on a bishop's counsel, yet know he reported secretly to Rome. A noble might win favor from the pope and use it to challenge his king. The church was both partner and rival, ally and overseer. And so, the medieval crown was never fully its own. It was always shadowed by the weight of the church. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the church's weapons were not swords or spears, but invisible powers: faith, fear, and salvation. A king might command armies, but a pope commanded souls. And in an age where heaven and hell were felt as vividly as life itself, this was the most formidable power of all. As you rest, picture a cathedral rising against the night sky, its bells tolling softly across the land. Within, candles glow, choirs sing, and yet, beyond prayers lies power, a vast hand guiding kings, shaping kingdoms, deciding fates. The shocking truth is that medieval politics was never only about thrones and swords. It was also about altars and blessings, curses and prayers. The crown and the cross, forever entwined. In the next and final part of this segment, we will drift into the hidden alliances, the quiet manipulations, and the secret forces that shaped medieval politics from behind the curtain. The roles of guilds, bankers, and even shadowy orders that held surprising sway. For now, let your thoughts rest upon the image of a medieval ruler, his crown glittering in torchlight, while above him, the towering presence of the church watchers, shaping every step of his reign. When we think of medieval power, the image of kings, queens, and bishops comes quickly to mind. But beneath the glitter of crowns and the solemnity of cathedrals lay another truth, one often hidden, one whispered but rarely sung: the quiet forces that moved kingdoms without ever sitting on thrones. Guilds, bankers, secret orders, and even wandering diplomats. They were the unseen architects of medieval politics. Their names rarely appear in chronicles. Their faces are seldom carved into stone. Yet their influence was woven into every treaty signed, every market opened, and every war declared. Guilds were associations of craftsmen and merchants, but to call them merely work groups would be to miss their enormity. A guild controlled trade set standards and regulated apprenticeships. If you wanted to sell shoes in a medieval town, you could not simply open a stall. You needed the approval of the Shoemakers Guild. If you wished to brew ale, the Brewers Guild sets the rules. But there were more guilds than economic regulators. They were political forces within cities. Guild leaders sat on town councils. Guild wealth funded militias and fortifications. Guild alliances decided which rulers a city would support. In many ways, a strong guild could rival a noble in influence. One shocking truth is that the power of kings often stopped at the gates of cities, and inside those walls, the guilds ruled. War, marriage alliances, and cathedral building all required money. And in the Middle Ages, kings often found themselves strapped for coins. Enter the bankers. Families like the Medicis in Italy or the Fuggers in Germany became the quiet financiers of Europe's rulers. They lent gold to kings, funded crusades, and underwrote wars. But with money came leverage. A king who owed a fortune to a banking family could not easily defy them. At times, bankers held greater sway over policy than entire councils of nobles. Even more shocking, some bankers lent to both sides of a conflict, ensuring profit regardless of which king emerged victorious. History is full of whispers about orders that wielded influence beyond their visible reach. The Knights Templar, for instance, began as warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. But soon, they amassed enormous wealth, creating a financial network across Europe. Pilgrims could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, centuries before modern banks. This made the Templars indispensable, not only to travelers but to kings. Their fortresses stored treasure. Their knights carried messages. Their loans funded wars. The shocking truth is that their power grew so great, kings feared them. Eventually, Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, accused them of heresy, arrested them, and dissolved the order. Yet, legends whisper that their treasure vanished, hidden away, and their influence lived on in secret. Another hidden layer of medieval politics was the world of envoys and spies. While kings rode in armor and nobles schemed openly, quiet men with letters in their cloaks traveled across borders, carrying secret agreements or gathering intelligence. A diplomat's pen could prevent war. A spy's word could ignite one. Merchants doubled as informants, carrying news from foreign courts. Priests overheard confessions that shaped royal strategies. Even minstrels, welcomed by their songs, sometimes served as ears for powerful patrons. The medieval stage was not only filled with armies and councils, but also with hidden messengers slipping through the night. Beyond the guilds and bankers lay the merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, Florence. These city-states, powered by trade, wielded influence that stretched far beyond their narrow streets. Venice, with its fleets of ships, became the gatekeeper of east-west trade. Genoa rivaled it fiercely, each city maneuvering through treaties, naval battles, and alliances with kings. Their merchants grew rich not just from selling goods, but from controlling the very routes by which those goods flowed. In many ways, the kings of landlocked kingdoms depended upon these maritime powers more than they cared to admit. This is another shocking truth. The medieval world was not only ruled by castles and palaces, but also by counting houses and docks. In many cases, power was not tied to titles at all, but to family networks. A noble house with sons in the clergy, daughters married into royal courts, and brothers in banking could weave a web of influence more enduring than a crown. Consider the Medici of Florence. Beginning as merchants, they became bankers to Europe's most powerful rulers, patrons of art, and eventually popes and queens. Their influence spanned generations, shaping the destiny of kingdoms. Such families reveal the hidden truth. Dynasties of power were not always visible on thrones but often standing behind them. What makes this part of medieval politics so fascinating, and so shocking, is how often the true levels of power were invisible to the people living under them. A peasant might believe his life was shaped only by his lord, his king, or his priest. But behind those figures stood guildmasters, bankers, merchants, and hidden orders, all weaving decisions that cascaded down into the fields and villages. Medieval politics, then, was not only a chess game played on open courts. It was also a shadow game, with hidden hands guiding the pieces. As you rest, imagine the great cathedral at night, bells tolling softly across a sleeping city. Within the stone streets, guild halls stand quiet. Merchant ships lie anchored in the harbor. And somewhere in a palace chamber, a banker writes a letter that will decide whether a king may wage war or must wait in silence. The shocking truth is that medieval power was never simple, never only about thrones and crowns. It was a web, a vast, intricate web, spun by kings, priests, guilds, merchants, and secret orders alike. And within that website, every life was touched. We have wandered through the palaces and cathedrals, the guild halls and counting houses, uncovering the true powers of the medieval world. We will journey into the shocking truths of daily life itself, the food people ate, the diseases they feared, the strange remedies they trusted, and the rhythms of life that shaped their nights and days. For now, allow your breath to slow. Let your mind settle in the quiet spaces of medieval towns, where both visible crowns and invisible hands work together to shape an age of wonder and fear. Imagine the hush of a medieval village at dawn. The first hints of pale light creep over thatched rooftops. Smoke curls lazily from the small holes in cottage roofs as hearths are rekindled. Chickens stir, their clucks breaking the silence, while a rooster's crow reminds all that the new day has begun. In this world, life is tethered to the natural rhythm of the sun. There are no clocks on walls, no alarms buzzing beside beds. Instead, the crowing of roosters, the tolling of church bells, and the faint glow of sunrise dictate when people rise and when they rest. For peasants, mornings are not leisurely. They are brisk, filled with tasks that cannot wait, tending animals, fetching water, stoking fires, baking bread, preparing tools for the fields. For the wealthy, mornings may begin with a prayer whispered in a private chapel or with servants dressing them in layers of linen, wool, and silk. Yet regardless of station, everyone begins the day in response to the same sun rising in the east. The The shocking truth here is that sleep itself was often divided into two segments, not one. People practiced what historians call segmented sleep. They would retire soon after sunset, wake around midnight for an hour or two, praying, talking quietly, or even visiting neighbors, and then fall into a second sleep until dawn. This rhythm, so foreign to us today, was entirely natural to them. Step inside a peasant's cottage. The walls are made of wattle and daub, timber lattices filled with mud and straw. The roof, thatched with reeds, keeps out most of the rain, though leaks are not uncommon. The floor is dirt, perhaps strewn with rushes or herbs to mask odors. In one corner sits a simple hearth, both stove and heater. The room is smoky, for chimneys are rare. Beds are little more than straw mattresses covered with linen sheets and woolen blankets. Entire families may share one space for warmth, parents, children, and sometimes even animals, who help to keep the chill away. Privacy is non-existent. Daily life is communal, not individual. The peasant household is a world of constant contact, of shared warmth and shared burdens. The shocking truth is how resilient people were within these spaces. What might seem unbearable to us, the smoke, the lack of sanitation, the constant closeness, was normal, even comforting, to them. In stark contrast, noble families lived in stone castles or manor houses. Yet even here, life was not as luxurious as one might imagine. Castle chambers were draughty, with wind whistling through gaps in stone walls. Fires blazed in great hearths, but warmth seldom reached the far corners of the room. Servants scurried about, bringing basins of water for washing, laying out garments, and preparing breakfast feasts. Beds, though grander than those of peasants, were not purely comfortable. Thick feather mattresses, heavy curtains to keep out drafts, and ornate coverings made them symbols of wealth. Yet lice and fleas did not discriminate. Even kings and queens scratched through their nights, plagued by the same pests as their lowest subjects. The shocking truth here is that nobility, despite their wealth, could not escape many of the discomforts of medieval life. A lord might wear silks and furs, but he still shivered in winter. A queen might sleep beneath embroidered sheets, but she still fought off the bites of unseen insects. With the fire rekindled and the morning prayer said, it is time to eat. For peasants, breakfast was simple, if eaten at all. Many began their day with only ale, weak and nourishing, and a hunk of coarse bread. Butter, cheese, or pottage, a kind of vegetable stew, might be added if supplies are allowed. Meat was rare, saved for special occasions. Children drank the same ale, as water was often unsafe. The weak small ale contained little alcohol but enough to kill harmful bacteria, making it safer than a nearby stream. Nobles, by contrast, began their day with richer fares. Fresh bread, roasted meats, spiced wine, fruits, and pastries graced their tables. Yet such abundance carried risk. Overindulgence was common, and without modern medicine, digestive illnesses were frequent among the wealthy. The shocking truth is that peasants' diets, though monotonous, were often healthier than those of nobles. Their simple meals of grains, legumes, and occasional vegetables provided more balanced nutrition than the heavy meats and sugars consumed by the elite. One of the most enduring myths about medieval life is that people never bathed. While it is true that they did not bathe daily as we do, they were not entirely neglectful of hygiene. Rivers, streams, and bathhouses were common in towns. Many people washed their hands and faces each morning, and nobles often had access to basins of warm water. Herbal concoctions, lavender, rosemary, sage, were used to freshen breath and cleanse bodies. However, full-body bathing was less frequent, partly due to modesty and partly due to the effort involved in heating large quantities of water. Bathhouses existed, but they were also places of social gathering and, at times, scandal, which drew criticism from the church. The shocking truth here is not that medieval people were utterly filthy, but that their hygiene practices were shaped by circumstance and culture. They cared for cleanliness, but in ways different from our modern expectations. As the morning lengthens, peasants head to the fields. Men and women alike labor from sunrise to sunset, their work tied to the seasons. In spring, fields are plowed and sown. In summer, crops are tended, hay is cut, and animals graze. In autumn, harvest fills barns with grain. In winter, tasks shift indoors, repairing tools, spinning wool, salting meats. The work is grueling but shared. Children join in as soon as they are able, carrying water, watching geese, or gathering wood. The shocking truth is that, despite hardship, peasants found rhythm and meaning in these tasks. Songs accompanied ploughing. Festivals marked the turn of seasons. Work was backbreaking, yes, but it was also woven with community and ritual. And so, the medieval morning unfolds, a rhythm of prayer, labor, bread, and smoke. Whether in a cottage or a castle, life begins with fire rekindled, with food prepared, with bodies readying for the laborious of the day. As you rest, picture the slow rising of the sun over distant fields, the toll of bells drifting across villages, and the murmur of voices as people step into the rhythms of their world. The shocking truth is that daily life, though harsh, carried its own quiet beauty, its patterns of resilience and community. As we continue, we will explore what people ate through the day, how they worked, what they wore, and the role of festivals and faith in shaping their lives. For now, let your mind wander through a medieval morning, soft with the haze of smoke and song, as the people of the Middle Ages begin their day. As the sun rises higher in the sky, the rhythm of labor slows, and people turn toward food once more. For peasants, the midday meal is the most substantial of the day. A pot of pottage bubbles over the fire, a thick stew of whatever is at hand: cabbage, onions, peas, carrots, and perhaps a scrap of salted pork or fish if fortune allows. Bread is broken, coarse, and dark from the use of rye or barley, sometimes hard enough to double as a trencher, a kind of edible plate. Cheese, often tangy and firm, makes its appearance, alongside more ale. On feast days or after successful hunts, a rabbit or wild bird might be added, roasted simply over the fire. Yet most days, the diet remains humble, built around grains and vegetables. The shocking truth here is how monotonous and repetitive food can be for common people. There were no supermarkets, no endless variety. Meals depended on what could be grown, stored, or preserved. Hunger in the winter months was common, and poor harvests could spell disaster. By contrast, nobles dined on dishes prepared with an artistry meant not just to nourish, but to dazzle. Their tables groaned under platters of roasted venison, spiced sauces, pies filled with fruits or meats, candied almonds, and sweet pastries. Spices imported from the east, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, transformed ordinary dishes into symbols of wealth and prestige. Yet this abundance was not always kind to the body. Rich foods, heavily spiced and preserved, placed a strain on digestion. Illnesses of excess, gout, fevers, stomach complaints, plagued many noble households. Thus, the shocking truth is revealed. The peasants, though poorer, often ate a diet more suited to survival and health than the nobles surrounded by delicacies. When the morning chores are done and the midday meal is eaten, peasants return to their tasks, clothed in garments both simple and practical. Men wear tunics of rough wool or linen, belted at the waist. Their hose, stitched from wool, are often patched and worn thinly from labor. Leather shoes or wooden clogs protect their feet, though many go barefoot in the summer months to save their footwear. Women dress in long kirtles of wool or linen, covered with aprons for work. A wimple or headscarf conceals the hair, practical for both modesty and protection. Colors are muted, drawn from natural dyes: browns, grays, greens, and soft blues. Clothing is not discarded lightly. A tunic may be patched again, handed down from parent to child. A cloak might last a lifetime, growing more worn each year but never abandoned until it falls apart entirely. The shocking truth is that fashion was not absent from peasant life. Even the poor took pride in appearance, weaving bright threads into garments or saving to buy a strip of dyed cloth. Yet clothing was precious, an investment, and treated with care unimaginable to us today. The noble, however, clothed himself or herself in garments that announced wealth before a word was spoken. Silks from the east shimmered in candlelight. Velvets in deep crimson, purples, and golds proclaimed both riches and power. Furs lined winter cloaks, ermine, sable, fox, and marten. Men of rank wore long tunics with wide sleeves, surcoats decorated with embroidery, and belts studded with precious metals. Women's gowns flowed to the floor, layered with chemises, surcoats, and elaborate veils or hennons, those tall, pointed headdresses that have become symbols of medieval elegance. The shocking truth, though, is that fashion could be dangerous. Fabrics trailed on dirty streets, dragging filth into noble halls. Long sleeves might catch in fire. Heavy furs overheated wearers in summer. And for women, tightly bound gowns restricted movement, emphasizing beauty at the cost of comfort. Even in luxury, the medieval body endured hardship. After dining and a brief rest, the peasant returns to the field, tools in hand. Work stretches on until the sun dips low. The tasks vary with the seasons. In spring, sowing seeds with careful rhythm, each handful cast into tilled earth. Summer, haymaking, scythe swinging through tall grasses, the sound of metal against stem a steady hymn to survival. Autumn, harvest, the most crucial time, when every ear of grain means life or hunger in the months to come. Winter, labor shifts indoors, with spinning, mending, brewing, and preparing stores for the cold. Women's work never ceases, both in the field and at home. They tend to be children, livestock, gardens, kitchens, and looms. Their labor, though often unrecorded, forms the backbone of medieval life. The shocking truth is how communal survival was. A family could not endure alone. Villagers worked together, sharing oxen for plowing, helping each other at harvest, and gathering in the evenings for stories and song. Children, too, were drawn into the rhythm of work early. By the age of 5 or 6, they carried water, gathered firewood, or herded animals. By then, they might work the fields or apprentice in a craft. Childhood was shorter, defined not by play but by duty. Yet children did find moments of joy. They played games with sticks and stones, rolled hoops, or fashioned dolls from scraps of cloth. Festivals gave them treats of sweetmeats or gingerbread. The shocking truth is that, while harsher, medieval childhood was not devoid of laughter. Joy bloomed even in poverty, threaded into the fabric of survival. The afternoon air was filled with sound. The steady thud of hammers from blacksmith forges, the creak of cartwheels along dirt tracks, the lowing of cattle, the cluck of hens, the bark of dogs. Songs are carried across fields, with workers chanting simple refrains to mark the rhythm of their labor. Bells from churches toll the hours, reminding all the passage of time and the constancy of faith. The shocking truth is that silence was rare. The medieval world was alive with noise, a chorus of human effort mingling with the voices of animals and the echo of bells. As the afternoon lengthens, the medieval day continues its steady rhythm. Food shared, clothes worn with care, labor pressed forward with strength and song. In these simple, repetitive acts, life unfolded in ways both fragile and enduring. The shocking truth of daily life is its resilience. In the face of hardship, monotony, and hunger, people found meaning, beauty, and laughter woven through their hours. Gradually, we will wander deeper into the evening routines, suppers, faith practices, storytelling, and how communities find light in darkness. But for now, let your thoughts drift through the fields of a medieval afternoon. The hum of work, the warmth of wool, the taste of coarse bread and ale. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting long shadows across fields and village lanes, people gather once more for food. For peasants, the evening meal is lighter than the midday feast. A pot of pottage may still sit upon the fire, reheated from earlier, thickened by the day's simmering. Bread, now perhaps a little stale, is dipped into the broth. If ale remains, it is poured into wooden mugs, shared around the family. On rare days, a piece of smoked or salted fish might be brought out, or a slice of bacon that has been carefully rationed. Children eat eagerly, their day of chores behind them. Families huddle close, warmed not just by food but by each other's company. The shocking truth is that many medieval peasants often went to bed still hungry. Food supplies had to be stretched, particularly in harsh winters. Unlike our world of surplus, theirs was a delicate balance between survival and shortage. For nobles, the evening meal was another chance for grandeur. Banquets might unfold with multiple courses: roasted meats, spiced sauces, almond milk stews, sugared fruits. Wine replaced ale, and goblets gleamed in torchlight. Music from minstrels filled the air, and conversation flowed as servants moved silently with platters. Yet this abundance carried its own burdens. Feasting could last late into the night, leaving diners sluggish and unwell. The shocking truth is that even amidst luxury, discomfort lingered: indigestion, overindulgence, and the strain of maintaining appearances. As twilight deepens, the rhythm of the day turns inward toward faith. The village church, its stone walls cool and strong, stands as the heart of the community. Bells call people to prayer. Vespers in the evening calm pline before bed. Men, women, and children gather within, kneeling upon straw-strewn floors, voices rising together in chant. Candles flicker, their light illuminating icons of saints, wooden crucifixes, or painted frescoes. The air smells of wax, of damp stone, of incense drifting slowly toward the rafters. The shocking truth is that faith was not just a matter of devotion but of necessity. Life was fragile, uncertain. Plague swept through villages, harvests failed, and wars erupted without warning. Faith offered comfort, explanation, and hope where little else could. Even those who worked too late to attend services might pause for a whispered prayer at home, crossing themselves before eating, before sleeping, before beginning again. Religion threaded through every act, binding the medieval world together with unseen cords of belief. After prayers and supper, as darkness settles more deeply, the day's labor finally gives way to rest. Families gather by the hearth, firelight dancing across their faces. Here, storytelling begins. Elders recount tales of saints, legends of brave knights, or myths passed down from generations. Children listen wide-eyed, lulled by the cadence of voices. Sometimes, stories are humorous, teasing, and playful. Other times, they carry warnings, teaching lessons of virtue, patience, or caution. Songs, too, fill the evening. Simple refrains sung by the fire, or ballads accompanied by a fiddle, lute, or even the rhythm of clapping hands. These were not performances for fame, but expressions of joy, sorrow, and the need to connect. The shocking truth is that, without books or modern entertainment, oral tradition was the lifeblood of culture. Knowledge, history, and values survived not in ink alone, but in the voices of countless unnamed storytellers. Each night, across villages and halls alike, words stitched from the past to the present. In noble households, evenings were both social and political. The Lord's Hall was a place of feasting, diplomacy, and entertainment. Guests might listen to troubadours singing of courtly love, or jesters performing tricks and riddles. Games of chess or dice were played at tables. Poets recited verses, while musicians strummed strings or blew through pipes. The shocking truth, however, is that even in these glittering halls, life was not entirely secure. Candles set fire to hangings. Drunken quarrels broke out between guests. Servants, often invisible in the background, carried the weight of labor to keep the illusion of splendor alive. And beneath the laughter, alliances were made, marriages arranged, disputes settled. The noble hall was not just for pleasure but for power. Outside, darkness lay heavy over fields and forests. Without modern lights, the medieval night was a world of mystery and fear. The only illumination came from torches, candles, and the moon. Paths between villages became dangerous, for travelers risked thieves, wild animals, or worse, the fear of spirits and wandering souls. People locked doors, barred shutters, and gathered close. Night belonged to the unknown, and only the bravest or most desperate ventured far after sundown. The shocking truth is that medieval people feared the dark far more than we do. Superstition, combined with real dangers, made night a realm of unease. And so, the hearth became a sanctuary, its small circle of light holding back the vastness of the unknown. As the fire burned low, the village hushed. Families whispered final prayers, children curled into straw beds, and adults stretched weary limbs. Some drifted into dreams quickly, soothed by exhaustion. Others lay awake, listening to the sounds of night, the hoot of an owl, the howl of a distant wolf, the creak of timber in the cold. In noble castles, chambers were prepared with care. Servants laid out blankets, warmed beds with heated stones, and secured locks on heavy doors. Lords and ladies retired, sometimes in solitude, sometimes surrounded by attendants, their sleep guarded against both danger and draught. The shocking truth is that sleep itself was different in the medieval world. Nights were often divided into two sleeps, a first sleep in the early night, followed by a period of wakefulness, prayer, or quiet talk, then a second sleep until dawn. This segmented rest, now unusual, was once entirely natural. So the medieval evening draws to a close. Supper eaten, prayers spoken, stories told, and fears of the dark kept at bay by faith and fire. Life was harsh, yes, but it was also filled with moments of closeness, tradition, and quiet wonder. The shocking truth is that even in such a different world, we find reflections of our own, the need for community, for stories, for the comfort of light in darkness. As the last embers of fire glow faintly in the hearth, the medieval world surrenders to night. Unlike our cities that never truly sleep, darkness in these times was almost absolute. Beyond the small flicker of candle or torch, there was only shadow, vast and enveloping. For peasants, the night meant rest from the relentless labor of the day. For nobles, it was a time of guarded retreat behind castle walls. But no matter one's station, night carried its own truths, both soothing and unsettling. In cottages, families crowded together on straw-filled mattresses, blankets made from wool or patched cloth pulled close. The warmth of many bodies together was a shield against the chill that crept through thin wooden walls. Parents slept near children, and sometimes animals were kept indoors too, not just for safety from thieves, but for the extra heat their bodies provided. The shocking truth is that medieval people were far more exposed to the elements than we are. Cold drafts slipped through cracks in walls. Rain sometimes seeped through poorly thatched roofs. The comfort of a home was never entirely secure. In noble castles, conditions were not as luxurious as we might imagine. Though chambers were larger and hung with tapestries, stone walls trapped dampness. Fires in great hearths warmed the halls, but private rooms could still be bitterly cold. Servants placed warm stones in beds or laid down furs, but the night air lingered heavily and chill. Before lying down, prayers were whispered. Families crossed themselves, entrusting the night to divine protection. Children might murmur rhymes for safety, believing they would guard against evil spirits or bad dreams. In castles, nobles too knelt at their bedsides, sometimes with chaplains present to recite evening devotions. Even sleep was not entered lightly. To close one's eyes in a world where death came suddenly, through illness, fire, or attack, was to place deep faith in waking again. The shocking truth is that medieval people did not sleep as we do today. Their nights were divided into two distinct rests. The first sleep lasted for several hours after dusk. Then, many people naturally woke in the middle of the night, not startled, but calmly, as though this interval was expected. During this waking period, they might tend to the fire, check on animals, speak quietly with family, or offer prayers. Some even used the time for intimacy, believing the hours between sleeps were especially fertile. After an hour or more, they would settle into their second sleep, lasting until dawn's first light. This rhythm of segmented slumber, now unusual, was then the norm. It reveals a striking difference between their lives and ours, a reminder of how profoundly our patterns have been shaped by modern lighting and clocks. As bodies rested, minds drifted into dreams. Medieval people often believed dreams carried messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from darker forces. A dream of a journey might signal a future pilgrimage. A dream of falling could be a warning of misfortune. Superstition wove through the interpretation of sleep. Nightmares, in particular, were thought to be caused by spirits pressing upon the chest, stealing one's breath. The word nightmare itself was born from these beliefs, the mare being a creature of darkness. The shocking truth is that many people feared not just the waking dangers of night, but what visited them in dreams. Spiritual protection was sought through prayer, charms, or even sprigs of herbs hung near the bed. Though the world quieted, the night was not silent. In villages, the creak of timbers in the wind, the rustle of straw, the distant bark of a dog, or the hoot of an owl mark the hours. In forests beyond, wolves howled, reminding listeners of dangers that lurked in the wild. In castles, guards moved along battlements, their footsteps echoing against stone. Watchmen called out the hours, striking bells or wooden clappers to mark the passing of time. Even behind high walls, there was no complete escape from unease. These sounds, familiar to them, might seem haunting to us, but they formed the background music of the medieval night, a reminder of both life and fragility. To guard against the uncertainties of darkness, many towns employed watchmen. These men patrolled streets with lanterns, calling out warnings against fire or theft. Their presence reassured yet also reminded people of the dangers that required such vigilance. The shocking truth is that fires at night were a constant terror. With homes built of timber and thatch, a single spark could engulf an entire village. Thus, the night watch was as much about preventing disaster as about keeping order. For nobles, the night sometimes brought intrigue. Secret meetings were held under the cover of darkness. Messengers slipped through castle gates. Political plots unfolded in whispers by candlelight. Even within the apparent safety of high walls, danger lingered. Intruders, betrayals, and assassinations often came under the cloak of night. The shocking truth is that for all their wealth and power, nobles were often haunted by fear of rivals, rebellion, of unseen threats lurking in the dark. In the medieval imagination, night was more than a time of rest. It was a threshold between the earth and the divine, the living and the spiritual. Monks in monasteries rose from sleep to chant the midnight office, their voices echoing in cold stone chapels, offering prayers for the world while most lay dreaming. To them, night was sacred, its silence a canvas upon which devotion could be painted. For ordinary people, too, night carried spiritual weight. Ghosts, angels, and demons were all believed to walk more freely under the moon's gaze. Protection was sought in charms, in holy symbols hung above beds, in whispered invocations. At last, the blackness softened. A pale light stretched across the horizon. Roosters crowed. Villages stirred, and the long cycle began again. For some, the night had been restful. For others, it was restless, broken by fear or hunger. Yet all rose to face another day of toil, prayer, and survival. The shocking truth is that despite hardship, each dawn was also a renewal, a gift embraced with gratitude, for life itself was never guaranteed. And so the medieval night fades. We have journeyed through cottages and castles, through prayers and dreams, through fears and fragile peace. Night in this world was not simply the absence of day, but a realm of mystery, devotion, and deep humanity. Let your own mind rest now as theirs did, drifting into a gentle slumber, held by the knowledge that even in the harshest times, people found comfort in faith, in firelight, and in one another. As our long journey through the medieval world draws to a close, take a slow, deep breath. Let the stories of the past settle softly in your mind, like the fading echoes of footsteps down a stone corridor. We began with myths, shining knights in armor, endless feasts in candlelit halls, and castles filled with music and majesty. Yet as we pulled back the curtain of legend, the shocking truths of medieval life appeared. They were not truths meant to frighten, but truths that reminded us of how fragile, resilient, and human life has always been. The Middle Ages were not fairy tales. Life was harder, colder, and far less certain than most of us can imagine today. Homes were smoky, diets were simple, disease struck without warning, and even kings were not safe from discomfort. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk, nobles wrestled with power and betrayal, and faith guided nearly every action. And yet, within that hardship, there were also moments of joy, markets filled with chatter, music drifting through villages, festivals that broke the monotony of work, and families sharing warmth by the hearth. The shocking truth is not only that medieval life was difficult, but that it was also deeply alive with laughter, tradition, and hope. When we peer across the centuries, what we discover is not a world entirely alien, but a reflection of ourselves. Like us, they dreamed of safety. They sought love, friendship, and belonging. They feared uncertainty. They looked to the stars and the heavens for meaning. The shocking truth is not that they were different, but that they were so very much the same. It is humbling to know that while we enjoy comforts they could scarcely imagine, warmth at the press of a switch, medicine to cure illness, abundance in food, the emotions that shape their lives still shape ours. Joy and sorrow, fear and hope, struggle and resilience. These are timeless. And perhaps that is why medieval history continues to draw us in. It whispers to us, not from a place of fantasy, but from the lived experiences of millions of ordinary people. Their world was built on rituals and routines, on prayer and persistence, on community and survival. When we look closely, we see echoes that still linger in our own world. The way we gather for festivals and holidays. The way faith and ritual still mark our lives. Even the way we sleep. Though modern habits differ, the memory of segmented rest lies deep within us. History is never only about the past. It is also a mirror in which we glimpse ourselves. And so, as you rest now, remember this. The shocking truth about medieval times is not just the dirt, the hunger, or the shadows of hardship. It is that life endured. That people loved, laughed, and carried on despite it all. That even in the darkest nights, there were moments of light. As you close your eyes, imagine the quiet of a medieval village at night, the last embers of a hearth glowing, the soft creak of wooden beams, the faint sound of wind against thatched roofs. In that stillness, someone centuries ago drifted into sleep, just as you will now. The centuries between you dissolve. The human story continues. Rest well, dear listener. For though the Middle Ages are long past, their truths remain, and their whispers accompany you gently into dreams.